Now we will move on to the first session, uh, where there are two papers. One paper is going to cover Mahabharata, the other Ramayana. How epics have environmentalist understanding. The first paper is going to be from Sri Megh Kalyanasundaram ji, who is known for his rigorous, academically rigorous, argumentative papers. He is one of our directors. He is director new projects in Indic Academy. He is looking after our Indica Classical Library, and he has many publications to his credit, who which have blown off many of the Indological distortions of Hinduism. And this paper also is actually, it has taken up a very significant topic called sustainability, which is a very important topic today. uh, it is the middle path. Sustainability is the middle path, and how sustainability is articulated in Mahabharata is chosen by Sri Megh Kalyanasundaram ji for his topic. I request Sri Megh ji to present his analysis of Mahabharata from this point of view. Thank you.
Namaste. Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada Shruti Smriti Purananam Alayam Karunalayam Namami Bhagavat Padam Shankaram Loka Shankaram Purananyaya Mimamsa Dharmashastranga Mishritaha Vedaha Sthanani Vidyanam Dharmasya Cha Chaturdasha Ayurvedo Dhanurvedo Gandharvaschaiva Tetrayah अर्थशास्त्रम चतुर्थंतु विद्याः अष्टादशैवताः ओम शांति शांति शांति. Namaste. At the outset, I would like to thank Harikiran Vadlamani ji, Professor Nagraj Paturi ji, Vade Srinivas ji, and Koti ji, and whoever else has contributed to making this conference, Hinduism and Environmentalism, possible. The title of my paper is, as you can see, Attributions in Sustainable Development Literature, an Indic case to look beyond European Enlightenment and towards the Mahabharata. The paper's abstract reads thus. In this paper, first, the mainstream sustainable development literature is studied to identify key historical attributions of the concept currently in vogue. In light of specific evidence from the critical edition of the Mahabharata, an Indic case is posited for revisiting one of the key attributions in the mainstream sustainable development literature. On the top of the screen right now is the structure of this presentation. I'll begin with a very brief overview of my academic work, followed by a glimpse of the Sustainable Development Goals. That will be followed by the literature survey in the introduction of this paper, and finally my analysis and argument, which can be found in the section From Silva to the Mahabharata in the paper. On the screen right now are screenshots from my Google Scholar profile, and which lists about over 20 papers. All these papers can be accessed from the academia profile Megh Kalyanasundaram. They broadly cover areas related to ancient Indian chronology, Indian knowledge systems, landscape and Indic texts, ancient Indian jurisprudence, ideas of India, and philosophy. A recent compositional music album of mine, Bharata and Her Kashmira, was accepted for listing in the Government of India's Ministry of Culture music app called Sangam. Before diving into the paper proper, it might not be out of place to quickly glimpse at the Sustainable Development Goals, goals that the Government of India takes seriously. While it is not necessary to read out each of these 17 goals, and I'm sure many of us have know either all of these 17 or at least some of them, or have seen this graphic, I do just want to mention Jason Hickel's paper, The Contradiction of the Sustainable Development Goals, Growth versus Ecology on a Finite Planet. And I think this paper would be interesting for people who are looking at the tension within the goals. And it was actually a point that was alluded to by the previous speaker, the invited speaker, on the limitations on growth. Keeping this as in the backdrop, move on to the paper proper. Correlating sustainable development to Indic texts, particularly Sanskrit texts, is an evolving domain. Some previous works in this area include Balachandran's 2011 paper Kautilya's Model of Sustainable Development, Mahāshumi Bhattacharya's chapter titled Concept of Sustainable Development in the Mahabharata, in her 2012 thesis, Environmental Concept as Reflected in the Mahabharata, Its Relevance in the Model World, and Yamini Narayanan's 2013 paper, Inspiring Sustainability Beyond Sustainability, Sustainable Development and the Ultimate Hindu Purpose. On a related and in some ways broader, yet in some other ways narrower topic of looking at Indic texts for textual evidence of protection, praise, worship, and conservation of different aspects of the environment, there exists now not only a CBSE education module titled Indian Traditional Knowledge on Environmental Conservation, but also at least one dedicated digital space, Environmental Studies, in the Vedic Heritage Portal maintained by the Ministry of Culture, Government of India. Other examples of broadly related and relatively earlier, around the turn of the century, 98 to 2002, impulses include literature related to uncovering insights pertaining to biodiversity conservation from Manu Samhita to Indian traditions and traditional knowledge systems. Cross-cultural comparative perspectives, though seemingly fewer, have also now emerged. Michel Denino's Nature in Indian and Western Traditions and For the Love of Nature, and Vishwa Adluri's Unburdening the Earth, Hinduism and Ecology, make for, in my view, trenchant reading, foregrounding perspectives from Indic texts and contrasting them to non-Indic ones across millennia. Sustainable development is, though, not only about environment, and while the above survey is not comprehensive, even when seen from just the intersection of sustainable development and the environment, what follows in the space of paper will be an addition to the above literature, whilst addressing the case outlined in the abstract. I just said sustainable development is not only about environment. What is it though? Author of the concept of sustainable development in the Mahabharata, Mahāshumi Bhattacharya presents a succinct overview, not just alluding to some globally influential definitions of the compound term, but also breaking the compound term down into its component words, foregrounding some of their definitions, and then synthesizing what she calls, quote, the three most important objectives of sustainable development, unquote. She has written, and I quote, over the last 3 decades, the term sustainable development has been defined in many ways, but one of the most popular definitions was coined by the World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Commission. The origin of this concept of sustainable development was pointed out in the World Conservation Strategy report published in 1980. The report of the Brundtland Commission 1987, Our Common Future, has popularized and defined the term sustainable development as, quote, sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs, unquote. The concept of sustainable development is precisely stated in the Encyclopedia of Ecology and Environment, Volume 10, as development that lasts. It emphasizes upon the balance between consumption and production of natural resources. It means that the well-being of the human beings depend on the judicious extraction, consumption, and utilization of natural resources, maintaining the regenerating capacity of nature. The aims and objectives of sustainable development are to raise the living standard and qualities of the lives of the people of present as well as the future generations, while conserving the environment and natural resources. So to secure economic well-being, social development, and environmental stability are the 3 most important objectives of sustainable development, unquote. Thereafter, while she goes on to correlate sustainable development with evidence, both direct and indirect, not just from the Mahabharata, and presents by and large a very credible case, I will go down one path she has not gone down, to look at historical attributions in some of the mainstream sustainable development literature and present an Indic case for why that attribution needs to be revised. While the Sustainable Development Commission's history of sustainable development went as far back as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962, Andre Feil and Dusan Schreiber, in their 2017 paper, Sustainability and Sustainable Development, Unraveling Overlays and Scope of Their Meanings, go back to John Evelyn's Silva, 1664. Quote, the selected time frame begins in the year 1664 with the publication of Silva by John Evelyn. It is considered that With this work initiated the concern with environment depletion and economic development, unquote. Fail and Schreiber are neither alone nor first in tracing back to Evelyn's silver. About 10 years earlier, Ulrich Grober's 2007 paper, Deep Roots, A Conceptual History of Sustainable Development, not only traces back to Evelyn's silver, but also explicitly credits Evelyn's work as, quote, 17th century forerunner of the Brundtland Report, unquote, and does not miss the opportunity to invoke the era of early European Enlightenment. Quote, the roots of this concept can be traced back to the era of early Enlightenment, unquote. Quote again, the soul of the project, however, was John Evelyn. On Feb 16, 1664, he presented to the king, the Royal Society, and to the public his Silva, or a discourse of forest trees and the propagation of timber in His Majesty's dominions. The book became a 17th century bestseller and instigated, according to Evelyn's remark in later editions, the planting of millions of trees all over England, unquote. Now, I'll deal with the portions emphasized, that is the ones in bold on screen right now, in the sequence that they appear. That Grober invokes European Enlightenment is highlighted to foreground the fact that this is one more in a list of attributions to European Enlightenment. As a very recent example, consider the following words of a globally influential academician, experimental psychologist, cognitive scientist, and linguist based at Harvard University, Steven Pinker, author of Enlightenment Now, How the Mind Works and the Better Angels of Our Nature, who associates reason and science themselves to the European Enlightenment. He has said, and I quote, human nature hasn't changed in the last couple of centuries. How did we manage to improve human life? There, I think ideas matter. One of the key ideas that, or set of ideas that led to human improvement were the ideas that we associate with the Enlightenment. The use of reason to figure out the world as opposed to dogma or faith or authority. The attempt to understand the physical world by applying reason to it or science, the idea of humanism, unquote. If an academician at Harvard in 2019 can associate reason and science to European Enlightenment alone, should Fail and Schreiber be expected to use Google search in 2016 to explore other potential historical attributions of sustainable development before 1664? If Pinker, Fail, and Schreiber can be excused, Grober's invocation of European Enlightenment in 2007 or earlier suddenly seems far less unacceptable. Now on to the second bolded statement. If it is not problematic enough that it is Evelyn's own remarks, apparently in some of his later editions, which constitutes the evidence for the planting of millions of trees all over England, at least the presumed impact of Evelyn's 1664 work has been squarely criticized and roundly questioned in Arpanen's paper, John Evelyn's Silva, Some Remarks on its Circumstances of Production, Reception, and Influence. He has written, and I quote, there is little explicit evidence to suggest that Silva or Evelyn in person had a direct influence upon the English state to initiate plantings in its royal forests. In the forests of Dean, for centuries, one of the sources of English naval timber, the issue of the availability of naval timber had by the time of Silva's publication, been on the agenda for many decades already. And it does not seem that the issue needed Evelyn as its publicist, unquote. Yet it is not just the Wikipedia link for sustainable development, but also books such as Biochemistry and Forestry Management, published in 2019 by EdTech Press UK, that cite the same line attributed to Evelyn. Quote, sustainable development has its roots in ideas about sustainable forest management, which were developed in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries in response to a growing awareness of the depletion of timber resources in England. John Evelyn argued that sowing and planting of trees had to be regarded as a national duty of every landowner in order to stop the destructive overexploitation of natural resources, unquote. Even if one were to allow for the possibility that Arpanen's critique might not be the last word, though I could not find any takedown of his critique so far, the above trace has brought us to those words attributed to Evelyn, to which all of sustainable development is currently traced back to. Namely, quote, sowing and planting of trees had to be regarded as a national duty of every landowner in order to stop the destructive overexploitation of natural resources. I posit that this attribution to Evelyn should be replaced by a far more comprehensive statement found in the critical edition of the Mahabharata, which you see on your screen right now. Ashayasho dapanasha prabhuta salila varaha nirodhavya sadaragnya shirinascha mahiruhaha. One translation of it in Hindi is as the following: Jalashay, that is Talab, Pokhare Adi, Udapan, Kuएं, बावड़ी आदि, प्रचुर जलाशय से भरी हुई बड़े बड़े तालाब तथा दूध वाले वृक्ष, इन सब की राजा को सदा रक्षा करनी चाहिए. Let me be very clear here. I am neither claiming that the above verse is the most comprehensive statement about sustainable development in Indic texts, nor do I claim that it is the oldest in world literature. I do, however, critique the current historical attribution to Evelyn for being Eurocentric and myopic, particularly in a post-Google era, and propose that it be replaced by the above verse from the Mahabharata until a more direct, more comprehensive, and an older one is proposed, which I suspect exists at least in the Indic corpus. This paper would succeed even more in one of its objectives if a more direct, more comprehensive, and an older Indic statement is proposed in the future in response to the above and goes on to supersede this. This is the bibliography of the paper. And I want to show these two images, which are on screen right now. They're not covered in this paper, but I happen to have come across them after I've written this paper and might be interested to anyone in the intersection of Hinduism, ecology, environmentalism, and more. Also from the point of view of critical analysis, because I've already seen some problematic issues in the Yale course, which is called Religions and Ecology, Restoring the Earth Community Specialization. I don't know if this has been done before, but I'm launching a Sanskrit single song based on these attestations, but in the interest of time, I don't want to play it. That will be accessible on SoundCloud. With this, I end my presentation. Thank you. And it is 10:50.
You have seen how Sri Megh comes up with rigorous proposals. He has shown with all sufficient evidence that the ideas of sustainability are available in Mahabharata. And actually, Sri Megh has kept himself open for any earlier references to sustainable development within Indic literature also. So I think, yeah, that is for another day, how Vedas, Rig Veda have very clear articulations of sustainable development, and how as a Veda Samhita, as Panchama Veda, Mahabharata is in fact actually only articulating the ideas of sustainable development within the Vedas. One very significant aspect of sustainable development that we need to keep in mind is it is the middle ground between development and anti-development. There is this extreme side of anti-development, also Luddite, anti-industrial approach to environmentalism that is found in movements like permaculture, where a book like One Straw Revolution by Fukuoka, it proposes no ploughing at all, no use of technology at all in agriculture. Fukuoka himself is an agricultural scientist with several different big projects within agricultural chemistry. After all his disillusionment with fertilizers and pesticides, as an agricultural scientist, he comes to his no ploughing, no technology solution. And you usually see parallels to this in approaches like in Buddhism and Jainism, where there is this extreme. So when you see Vedic approach of within Vedas, Veda mantras, and other Indic texts and Hindu texts, the approach of Artha not being bad at all, Kama not being bad at all, but everything that needs to be within Dharma that approach is very similar to sustainable development. When you contrast the contemporary, when you see the contrast between contemporary anti-industrial, anti-technology approaches, then you see the distinction of sustainable development. Sustainable development, and it is here that you have parallels within Indic cultures to anti-industrial, anti-technology movements, like in Buddhism and Jainism. And it is there that Hinduism and Vedic culture stands in distinction for its sustainable development approach. And that in Veda mantras, you see both kinds of instructions for Artha Kama acquisition as being encouraged in the mantras. And at the same time, you have mantras with Mahimsihi statements. So that combination also is seen in some Rigveda mantras, and only that sustainable approach that was there in the Veda mantras is being just articulated in the Panchama Veda in Mahabharata. So wonderful. As always, Sri Meghji has come up with such a wonderful proposal, and he has exposed usual Eurocentric claims that it is they who actually, it is those European scientists who brought the crisis, and it is they who claim that they are the ones who are bringing sustainable development also. But actually, if they look at themselves, they would realize that they brought the crisis, but not the solution. Solution is within the traditional cultures of the world, pagan cultures, indigenous cultures, including Hinduism. But the beauty of Hinduism is that in other indigenous cultures and pagan cultures, the Shastric articulation, logical, argumentative articulation of these positions is not available. They are only expressed in the form of cultural practices, in the cultural beliefs of those communities. But the distinction of Hinduism and Vedic culture is that it developed a Shastra out of all this, and a Shastric articulation in competition to the contemporary scientific articulations of both pre-environmentalist and post-environmentalist scientific arguments we find in Hinduism and Vedic culture.